Chris Hahn, host of the Aggressive Progressive podcast, is with us. Chris, why is it that the president only seems to care when it's a hate crime carried out by a young white male?
Well, these are very different crimes. I'm not saying which one's better or worse. I think they're both horrible, and I agree with you. They're both acts of terrorism. David Chou, though, moved from China to Taiwan as a young man, and about 4 years ago, his wife left him and moved to Taiwan. And he has been in a steady decline ever since. And then he carried out this ruthless act of terrorism against Taiwanese. He probably didn't have a suitable target in Las Vegas, and he drove to California to an easy target like that, which is horrible and despicable. And I think everybody in America should be outraged by it. But again, I don't know that I wouldn't classify his indoctrination as something that happened because he heard Chinese statements. The man grew up in China. We have no
way of knowing what did or did not indoctrinate him. In the same way, we have no idea whether Chris, we have no idea whether the gunman in Buffalo ever watched Fox News. His name was not mentioned. We have no idea if he ever listened to Elise Stefanik or any other Republican politician. Yet the president and other members of the Democratic Party are awfully quick to criticize those people.
Well, we are aware that the man from Buffalo was an active man online in right-wing communities, on right-wing websites. Whether or not he watched Tucker Carlson, who tries to soften up the white nationalist extremists that he courts to as viewers, I don't know. But I do know that in his manifesto, he is directly quoting white nationalist groups
and David Chou is directly quoting Chinese rhetoric about, in his notes, he's talking about how much he hates Taiwan. I'm interested in because of what the Chinese say. But I want to get to what the president's rhetoric is. Here's President Biden talking about how America is in danger. Oddly enough, it's on the anniversary of the Board decision 1954, when America was at a very different place. Here's what the president had to say.
The American experiment in democracy is in a danger like it hasn't been in my lifetime. It's in danger this hour. Hate and fear are being given too much oxygen by those who pretend to love America, but who don't understand America.
George Wallace won 4 states as a segregationist candidate. That was in President Biden's lifetime. Civil rights movement, we went through Jim Crow. Really today is the most dangerous time. Why divide the country like this?
I mean, obviously, Wallace was a horrible human being, and thank God he never became president. And the fact that he won 4 states should terrify us all. But unfortunately, the movement that allowed him to win 4 states is on the march again and on the rise, whether or not we want to attribute it to what happened over this weekend or not. And it is something that this country should be aware of. And unfortunately, in today's society, the only way you get attention is by making statements that put things in the most extreme light. And I think that's what the president is trying to do there. And obviously, the president does this often. You and I probably have a conversation every week about
But it goes to the same thing about ultra MAGA and the MAGA king and calling MAGA the most divisive political movement. There's no way that language tries to unify the country. That's about unifying the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, right?
But I don't see the need for the president to be unifying around with people who, call him a pedophile.
Come on. We can all agree. Hold on. We can all agree.
They are literally out there trying to subvert elections.
Okay, but we can also agree that there's 40%. Hold on. But Chris, we can all agree that there's some portion of America that voted for President Trump, or that supports President Trump and supports the Republican Party, that are neither racist nor election deniers, and the president ain't talking to them.
Oh, I think he is. I think the president is trying to say to those people who are not election deniers and who are not racist, look, you're in a party that is basically encouraging and supporting people who are election deniers and are racist.
You know what, Chris?
Let's be clear. There are a large amount of racists in that movement.
Okay, fine. I'll grant you that there is a large amount of racists in the Republican Party. If you'll grant me, there's a large amount of anti-Semitics in the Democratic Party, and here's why. Squad members. These are members of Congress. These are not just members of the Democratic Party. Squad members introduced resolution calling Israel's founding, quote, a catastrophe. past few minutes, members of the Squad, far-left House lawmakers have called on the U.S. government to describe the events surrounding Israel's founding with the Palestinian term Nakba, an Arabic word meaning catastrophe. These are members of Congress.
Yeah, and we could talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene, and we could go back and forth about people's extremists. And unfortunately, the way the House is gerrymandered, you're going to have significant extremists on both sides for the foreseeable future until the Supreme Court decides that partisan gerrymandering is not something that's in the best.
Marjorie Taylor Greene has not come out and said anything that is nearly as overtly racist or anti-Semitic as this.
Jewish space lasers controlling us. I don't know. Is that
she's been completely ostracized from the Republican Party. The Squad has not been.
Well, I think that you're telling me something that just came out a minute ago, and let me ostracize them right now for that as a Holocaust survivor's grandson who believes in Israel and who worked for Senator Chuck Schumer, arguably one of the leading members of the Democratic Party, also a Jew. So I know that the Democratic Party is overtly anti-Semitic, but there are people within the Democratic Party that need to understand the importance of Israel and need to step back from those kinds of comments.
Okay, so can we agree
and
then
I call them out, and I rebuke them.
And you always do, but at the same level, again, if a Republican gets up and says every member of the Democratic Party is anti-Semitic, how's that any different than President Biden getting up and saying every member of the Republican Party is racist?
I don't think he's saying that.
When he's saying, if you believe in MAGA, it's the most extreme ideology there is.
I think that the MAGA movement right now thinks of one thing, and that is that the election was stolen. And
come on, that's not. Come on, Chris. You and I know that.
He should not be president.
You and I know. Come on, Chris.
Remove him today if they could.
You and I know there's a lot of people who voted for President Trump who did not believe the election was stolen.
There are a lot of people who voted for President Trump that are not part of the MAGA movement. Let's leave it at that. Right? The MAGA movement is very different. I don't think it's the entirety of the Republican Party at all. I think it is dominant in the Republican Party, but I don't think it is the entirety of it. I think there are a lot of good people in the Republican Party. I love a lot of people in the Republican Party personally, but there are a lot of people in the Republican Party that are driving the message of the Republican Party that need to be called to task by those other good people in the Republican Party. I've seen you do it. I've actually seen you do it.
Well, we like to call everybody to task, and you make a good point about calling members of your own party to task, which you're willing to do. Chris,
every time I disagree with them, I will call them out. I'm not looking to run for office anymore, and frankly, if they believe that about Israel, screw them.
Well, no better way to end the interview. It's good to see you, my friend. Thank you.
Nice to see you, too.
All right. Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.